They mocked the woman and threw powder at her, but they didn't know who she really was. The ending shocked everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. Ronda Rousey had always lived in the rhythm of discipline. Years of training camps, years of early mornings filled with sweat, aching muscles, the echoes of the coach's whistle, and the relentless repetition of throws and strikes had left their imprint on her body and her mind. Even now, long after her professional career in the octagon was supposed to have ended, she could still feel the hum of that routine in her bones. Some days she woke up before dawn out of habit, her hands twitching as if they expected gloves to be wrapped around them, her shoulders remembering the pressure of sparring. Other days, like this one, she tried to quiet the restlessness by telling herself she was free at last. But freedom was a strange thing when you had lived so long with the structure of combat. That evening, Los Angeles seemed quieter than usual. She had just finished a long training session that was more about keeping herself balanced than preparing for any fight. The gym had been nearly empty, only a couple of young fighters working pads in the corner, glancing at her now and then with a mixture of awe and curiosity. She had smiled politely, offered them encouragement, but inside she felt the old hollowness creeping in. She no longer belonged to that world, at least not officially. The championships, the headlines, the roar of the crowd chanting her name, it was all part of another life, one she could replay in memory but not touch again. She drove her silver pickup through the outskirts of the city, the windows down to let in the cooling night air. The freeway lights blurred into streaks of yellow and white, her reflection sometimes appearing in the side mirror, hard-eyed and thoughtful. In the background of her mind, echoes of commentary still played. Men arguing on sports shows about whether her victories had been legitimate, whether she had truly proven herself, whether a woman could ever stand equal to men in combat sports. She had fought them all before, with her fists, with her discipline, with her very presence in the cage, but their voices still haunted her. Tonight she told herself she would do something ordinary, something simple. She would stop by a grocery store, pick up a few things, drive home, and let the silence of her own space settle around her. That was supposed to be the plan. She wanted to prove to herself that she could be like everyone else, a woman running errands on a quiet evening. She pulled into a parking lot, the hum of cicadas mixing with the faint buzz of neon from a liquor store across the street. The lot was nearly empty. Only a few cars dotted the asphalt, their windshields reflecting the dying orange of the sunset. Inside the store, she tried to lose herself among the aisles, but even this task felt alien. Rows and rows of options for everything. Cereals, bread, milk, so many choices that seemed absurd after a life where every day had been boiled down to routines and essentials. She felt almost overwhelmed by the abundance, her hands hovering over items without conviction. Eventually, she grabbed a carton of eggs, some bottled water, a loaf of bread, and told herself it was enough. She paid quickly, her head bowed, avoiding recognition. Even now, people sometimes stared, whispered, asked for a selfie. Some smiled, some smirked. Not everyone who knew her name respected her. When she stepped back outside, the sky had deepened to indigo. She slid into her truck, placed the bag on the passenger seat, and let her hands rest on the steering wheel. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a long breath. But instead of peace, she saw flashes again, her body twisting on the mat, an opponent's face grimacing in pain, the adrenaline rushing through her chest. Then darker images, broken noses, split lips, the roar of men jeering or cheering, never neutral. And beneath it all, the memory of defeat, of being mocked in headlines, of men's laughter on late-night shows. She pushed the thoughts away with another breath and opened her eyes. The parking lot was nearly empty now. A few distant lamps buzzed, their cones of light leaving patches of shadow. That was when she saw the patrol car glide into view. No siren, no flashing lights, just the slow, predatory crawl of a vehicle that seemed less interested in maintaining order than encircling prey. She stiffened slightly, though she didn't move. She had been stopped before, knew the drill, knew that sometimes her fame gave her protection and sometimes it only provoked resentment. The black and white cruiser pulled across the lot, stopping several spaces away. She could see two figures inside, silhouettes against the faint glow of the dashboard. For a few moments, nothing happened, the officers lingering as if deciding what to do. Ronda adjusted her posture, straightening her back, her hand resting lightly near the gear shift. Calm, she told herself. Stay calm. Eventually, the patrol car rolled closer, turning its nose toward her truck. The engine idled loudly. She glanced at the clock on the dash. Nearly 9 in the evening. Her plan had been to drive home, cook something simple, maybe watch a show to quiet her restless mind. Instead, she felt the world narrowing to this moment, this encounter. The quiet evening was no longer ordinary. It was shifting, shaping itself into something else, something heavier. The headlights flared briefly, catching her in the face before they shut off. Both doors of the cruiser opened, and 2 men stepped out. She watched them in the side mirror and the windshield's reflection as they closed their doors with casual force. One was tall and broad, moving with a swagger that spoke of arrogance more than authority. The other was leaner, with a sly grin that curled even in shadow. They didn't approach immediately, as if savoring the moment, drawing it out. Her heartbeat slowed, not quickened. Years of stepping into cages, years of walking toward opponents with the weight of the world on her shoulders had trained her for this. Every nerve in her body wanted to tense, to prepare, but she reminded herself that she was not in a fight. Not yet. She was in a parking lot, in her truck, a civilian. This was supposed to be an ordinary night. She told herself she would comply, stay calm, not give them a reason. But in her chest, beneath the practiced composure, another feeling was rising. The old fire, the instinct that told her that once again, whether she liked it or not, a confrontation was coming. And in the dim light of that empty parking lot, as the 2 officers began to walk toward her, Ronda Rousey realized that the ordinary evening she had longed for was already gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, something she could not yet name, but could already feel pressing down on her like the weight of an unseen opponent waiting for the bell. The silence in the parking lot seemed to grow heavier as the 2 officers advanced. Their footsteps echoed softly against the asphalt, not hurried but deliberate, a kind of unspoken announcement of their power. Ronda watched them approach, every detail etching itself into her memory. The taller of the 2 carried himself with the air of someone used to domination, his broad shoulders rocking as he walked, his jaw set in a smirk that never reached his eyes. The other, leaner and slightly younger, trailed half a step behind, his grin sharper, like a spectator amused by a show he already knew the ending to. Together they moved as if the space belonged to them, as if anyone within it existed at their mercy. Ronda remained seated in her truck, her hand tightening slightly on the steering wheel, her body language calm but alert. She had been in countless confrontations, most of them physical, some of them verbal, and all of them tests of willpower. This, however, felt different. The men approaching her were not opponents in a cage, bound by rules and referees. They were men cloaked in the authority of uniforms, armed not only with weapons, but with the kind of arrogance that came from knowing the system often looked the other way. She exhaled slowly through her nose, forcing herself to stay grounded, reminding herself that her goal tonight had been to do something ordinary, The taller officer reached her door first and leaned down, his shadow falling across her. He tapped the side of the truck with the tips of his fingers, a casual gesture that sounded louder than it should have in the empty lot. His smirk widened as he tilted his head, pretending to inspect the vehicle. "Nice truck," he said at last, his tone dripping with condescension, the words more like an insult than a compliment. "Expensive one, too. Not the kind of ride I'd expect a girl to be driving." Rhonda's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. Years of facing jeers from men in crowds, of being mocked for daring to step into a sport they considered theirs, had trained her for this. She knew their tactics: chip away, undermine, belittle until the target snapped. She only inclined her head slightly, as though the comment hadn't touched her. Yet inside, the heat began to flicker, that stubborn fire that had carried her through championships and defeats alike. The second officer moved closer, his grin never fading. He circled slowly, glancing through the window, studying her the way one might study an animal at a zoo. "I know that face," he said, drawing out the words as if tasting them. "You're that fighter, right? The one who used to roll around in the cage. I watched a couple of those matches. Didn't look like much to me. All hype." He gave a short laugh, sharp and cutting. "You ask me. Women don't belong in that world. It's a man's sport. Always was, always will be." Her heart did not race, but her grip on the steering wheel tightened. She had heard these lines before, spoken by countless critics, commentators, strangers who thought diminishing her achievements elevated their own fragile egos. That it came now from a man with a badge made it sting differently. This wasn't banter, nor even ignorant insult. This was power, wrapped in misogyny, directed at her in a dark parking lot where she stood alone against two. The taller officer stepped back and gestured lazily for her to roll down the window. Rhonda complied, lowering it halfway, her expression unreadable. "Evening," she said, her voice even, as if she could still pretend this was a routine encounter. "License and registration," the taller one demanded, though the words sounded less like a request than a test. She handed them over smoothly, her movements precise, her mind already calculating every angle. He held the documents longer than necessary, squinting at them with exaggerated slowness before glancing back at her. "Ronda Rousey," he drawled, as if the name itself were a challenge. "Colonel of the cage fights, huh? Doesn't mean much out here. Out here, we're the ones in charge." The leaner officer chuckled at that, shaking his head as though the situation amused him to no end. He placed a hand on the roof of her truck and leaned in closer, the scent of his cologne sharp in the night air. "Tell me, champ, what's it like pretending to be tough in front of cameras? You get tired of playing dress-up in gloves? Bet it's different when you've got real men to deal with." Rhonda's stomach turned, but her face remained a mask. She had stood across from women who wanted to break her bones, had stared into the eyes of rivals who despised her very existence. She had learned then that silence could be its own weapon, that control was more powerful than reaction. She let the words pass over her, knowing they were not intended for truth but for provocation. Yet each one chipped away at the facade of civility this encounter was supposed to carry. The taller officer finally passed the documents back, though not without a pause, as if reluctant to return them. His eyes lingered on her, dark and heavy with disdain. "Step out of the vehicle," he said flatly. She froze for a moment, not because she feared the command, but because she recognized what it meant. This was no simple traffic stop. There was no legitimate reason for her to step out, no law she had broken. This was about power, about forcing compliance, about showing her that her identity, her fame, her strength meant nothing compared to the authority they wielded. For a heartbeat she considered refusing, But her training told her otherwise. Years of experience had drilled into her the importance of control of her emotions, control of her movements, control of escalation. She reached for the door handle, her motions deliberate, and pushed it open. The night air swept in, cool against her skin, as she stepped down from the truck. Her boots touched the asphalt with the quiet certainty of someone who had walked into arenas filled with hostile crowds. She squared her shoulders, every line of her body calm, though inside her instincts screamed to prepare. The leaner officer smirked as he circled around to stand a little behind her, cutting off retreat. The taller one moved closer, towering, his gaze fixed on her like a predator sizing up prey. "Spread your legs," he ordered. His voice carried the tone of command, but also something uglier, something that wasn't procedure at all, but mockery disguised as authority. Rhonda complied, her stance wide and balanced, her hands resting lightly on the cool metal of her truck's roof. The frisk that followed was anything but professional. His hands lingered, rougher than necessary, pressing too hard, sliding lower than protocol demanded. The leaner officer laughed quietly, making comments under his breath, every syllable sharpened to wound. They weren't looking for weapons. They were looking for weakness. Her body remained still, but inside the storm grew stronger. Every instinct from her years of combat wanted her to react, to twist, to strike, to end this. But she kept control. She knew too well how quickly the story could be twisted if she moved too soon, how easily they could claim resistance where there was none. Her silence was not submission, it was calculation. When the frisk ended, the taller officer stepped back, a grin on his face as though satisfied not with safety but with victory. "Nothing yet," he muttered, glancing at his partner. The leaner one only smirked wider, shaking his head. "Don't worry. We'll find something. Always do." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Rhonda straightened slowly, turning her head just enough to catch both of them in her gaze. Her eyes were calm, unflinching, the eyes of a woman who had endured ridicule, defeat, and violence, and had never broken. They wanted to rattle her, to chip away at her dignity until she lashed out or crumbled. But she stood unmoved, waiting, watching, calculating. The ordinary evening had already slipped into something darker. The game was changing, and she knew it. As the officers exchanged smirks and whispered to each other, she understood with the same clarity that had carried her through countless fights. This was only the beginning. The atmosphere around the truck shifted once Rhonda stepped fully out into the open. The two officers exchanged a glance that carried with it a wordless agreement, as though the routine formality of a stop had been dismissed, and what remained was their game, their stage, and their prey. The taller one, who had smirked from the moment he approached, moved toward the passenger side door and yanked it open without asking. Her bag was still on the seat, the simple groceries she had picked up resting inside. He reached in, pulled it out, and let it fall deliberately onto the ground so that the carton of eggs cracked against the pavement and the loaf of bread tumbled into the dirt. The sound was small, but in the empty lot it was amplified, as if the entire act had been meant to carry insult more than effect. The leaner officer gave a short, amused laugh as he crouched to pick up one of the bottles of water, twisting the cap as though testing its seal. He tilted it, letting a few drops spill onto the ground, then tossed it carelessly back into the ruined bag. "Sloppy," he muttered, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. His grin never wavered, and Rhonda saw in it not curiosity but malice. They weren't searching for anything. They were dismantling pieces of her evening for the pleasure of watching her endure it. She stood with her hands at her sides, her stance calm, her breathing measured. Years of training had conditioned her to remain unmoved under provocation. But that discipline was tested now in a way unlike the controlled chaos of competition. These were not rivals bound by the same rules, not opponents who respected the fight even in hatred. These were men with authority, exploiting the shield of their uniforms to twist power into cruelty. The taller one rifled through her bag with exaggerated force, muttering sarcastic comments under his breath as he pulled out her personal items. He found a small notebook where she sometimes scribbled training notes or thoughts late at night and flipped it open, thumbing through the pages. His eyebrows rose as though the private scrawl amused him, and then he let it slip from his hand onto the asphalt. It lay there open, the writing vulnerable under the dim light. Another piece of her life tossed aside. Meanwhile, the leaner one shifted closer to her. He did not speak at first. He simply moved into her personal space until the air itself felt weighted. When he did speak, his voice carried a mock softness that made her skin crawl. "You know, sometimes it's easier if you just cooperate," he said, letting his gaze travel down her frame in a way that had nothing to do with law enforcement. "No one wants to spend their night making things harder than they need to be." Rhonda's stomach clenched, but she held his gaze without a flicker. She had faced down stares meant to intimidate, meant to reduce her, and she would not give this one the satisfaction of flinching. Still, the meaning in his words was clear, and the tall one seemed to savor the tension as he dropped the last of her belongings back into the ruined bag. When he stood again, he brushed his hands together as if dusting off dirt, though there was none. His smirk deepened, and he moved to stand on her other side so that the two of them formed a narrow space around her. She was boxed in now, her truck behind her, two armed men in front. Their posture was casual, but the intent was unmistakable. The taller one tilted his head and clicked his tongue. "Funny thing, you being who you are," he said. "All those fights, all those headlines, people cheered, sure. But out here?" He gestured around the lot, empty and silent except for the buzz of the lamps. "Out here, none of that matters. You're just another girl we pulled over. And when we tell the story, no one's going to care what you have to say about it." His partner chuckled again, leaning a little closer so that his shoulder nearly brushed hers. "She's tougher than she looks," he said mockingly, as though she weren't right there hearing him. "But toughness doesn't count for much, does it?" His eyes glinted and his smirk sharpened. "Out here, it's just you and us." Rhonda felt the familiar coil of tension in her muscles, that preparation her body always made before a fight. But she forced it down, keeping her arms loose, her breathing steady. She had to measure every choice now, because the wrong one could be twisted into justification for whatever came next. They wanted her to snap, to lash out, to hand them the excuse they needed to claim control. The taller one suddenly reached forward, his hand grazing her hip in what was supposed to look like part of a search, but lingered too long, pressed too close. It was deliberate, and the smirk on his face confirmed it. His partner grinned wider, shaking his head as though entertained by the show. "Careful now," the taller one said mockingly, pulling his hand back at last. "Wouldn't want anyone to think you're resisting." The heat surged through her chest, and for a moment she imagined twisting his wrist, driving him to the ground with the ease that years of judo training had given her. She could already picture the throw, the angle, the impact. But she held still, her body unmoving, her face calm. They were pushing, escalating, baiting her into giving them the moment they wanted. Then came the command, blunt and sharp. "Hands behind your back." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't move. The taller officer stepped closer, his hand already reaching for her arm. The leaner one shifted to the side, pulling a pair of cuffs from his belt, the metallic rattle loud in the night. They weren't arresting her for anything she had done. This was a show of force, a punishment for not bending quickly enough, for not breaking under their taunts and harassment. When the taller one grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her, she let out a breath that was half control, half the last restraint before the storm. His grip was unnecessarily rough, grinding bone against tendon, and the cuffs glinted as his partner prepared to snap them shut. In that moment, she understood that the line between insult and assault had already been crossed, and the path forward was narrowing to only two choices: submission to humiliation or resistance born of necessity. The parking lot seemed to close in around her, the buzzing lamps above a harsh reminder of how exposed she was. The world outside was silent, indifferent, as two men in uniform tried to remind her of how small they thought she should be. But she was not small. She had never been small. And though she held herself still now, letting them believe they had her pinned, deep inside her, the fighter's fire was already awake, burning hotter with every second. The night was no longer quiet, no longer ordinary. It had become the stage of something darker, something calculated. And though she had not yet moved, though her body still appeared compliant, Ronda Rousey knew with absolute certainty that this confrontation had only begun. The snap of cold metal against her wrist was the last straw. The taller officer had twisted her arm back too far, grinding the joint until pain flared across her nerves, and the leaner one was already stepping forward with the cuffs. For a moment, Ronda remained as still as stone, her breath controlled, her posture unchanged. She had spent her entire life training to hold composure in the face of pain, to breathe through the agony of locked joints and crushing pressure. But what they mistook for submission was in fact calculation. The final seconds she allowed herself to measure every angle, every move, every consequence. The cuffs glinted in the yellow light as the leaner officer raised them, smirking as though the game were already won. That was when Ronda shifted. The movement was so subtle at first it seemed like nothing at all, just a shift of weight on her feet. But the years of training, the thousands of repetitions on mats and in cages, meant her body was already coiled like a spring. In one seamless motion, she dropped her weight, rotated her hips, and exploded upward. The taller officer, who had been grinding her wrist behind her back, found his balance stolen in an instant. Her shoulder rolled under his grip, her body pivoted, and with a sharp tug and twist, she launched him forward over her hip. He hit the asphalt with a thud that drove the air out of his lungs. The cuffs clattered from his partner's hand as he staggered back, eyes wide in shock. The taller man groaned, clutching at his side, too stunned to move. It had taken less than a second. To anyone watching, it would have seemed almost unreal the way her body flowed from stillness into sudden, devastating control. The leaner officer's grin vanished, replaced by disbelief that flickered into rage. He lunged forward, reaching for her arm, but Ronda was already moving. She sidestepped, hooked his wrist, and guided his momentum forward. In an instant, she had him bent over the hood of her truck, his arm twisted painfully behind his back in a lock that froze him where he stood. His free hand slapped against the metal, his breath hissing between his teeth as the joint strained. "Stop resisting!" he shouted through clenched teeth, though it was he who was caught and immobilized. His words were more for the illusion of authority than for truth, a desperate attempt to make the moment fit the narrative they had built. Ronda's grip tightened, her body low and balanced, her movements precise. She applied just enough pressure to make his arm tremble, to make him understand she could break it if she chose. But she didn't. Her control was absolute, her restraint measured. She wasn't here to injure for the sake of injury. She was here to survive, to defend, to make sure that they could no longer mistake her silence for weakness. The taller officer was already pushing himself up from the ground, groaning in pain, his face twisted with humiliation. He staggered toward her, fury burning in his eyes. But Ronda had been watching him from the corner of her vision, anticipating his move. She released the leaner one with a sudden shove that sent him sprawling across the hood, then pivoted to meet the other head-on. He swung at her, clumsy with rage, his fist arcing wide in a blow meant to overpower. She ducked under it, her body flowing with the ease of years spent slipping strikes, and drove her shoulder into his midsection. The impact lifted him slightly off balance, and before he could recover, she hooked his leg, swept him sideways, and sent him crashing down again. This time she followed him, pinning his arm against the asphalt, her knee pressing into his chest. He thrashed, but she held him steady, her breath calm, her face set in cold determination. The leaner officer pushed himself off the hood and charged again, but Ronda was ready. She caught him by the collar, used his own momentum against him, and dragged him into a chokehold, her forearm pressing against his throat just enough to cut his air without crushing it. His hands clawed at her arm, his eyes bulging with the realization that this was no longer a one-sided display of dominance. This was survival, and he was on the wrong side of it. For a moment, the parking lot was filled only with the sounds of their struggle, the labored gasps of the men who had thought they held all the power, the thud of bodies against metal and asphalt, the calm, steady breathing of the woman who had lived her entire life inside battles like this. Ronda controlled them both, one pinned beneath her knee, the other caught in her chokehold. With minimal effort, she had turned their show of force into a spectacle of humiliation. Her eyes scanned the lot, half expecting another patrol car to arrive, half calculating how long it would take for them to recover and try again. But for now, the two men were subdued, trapped in the iron grip of someone they had underestimated. Her muscles burned with restrained energy, the need to keep control without going too far. She knew if she injured them beyond repair, the story would twist even more viciously against her. They would claim she had attacked officers unprovoked, that she had gone too far. She had to walk the razor's edge between defending herself and becoming the villain in their narrative. The taller one beneath her knee spat a curse, his face red with exertion. "You're finished," he growled, though his voice cracked under the pressure. The words lacked the weight they once carried. The leaner one choked against her arm, his body weakening as oxygen fled his lungs, his legs buckling beneath him. She released him at the last second, shoving him to the ground where he collapsed, coughing and gasping, his authority stripped away as easily as his breath. She rose slowly, her chest rising and falling in controlled rhythm, and took a step back. Both men lay sprawled on the ground, battered not by strikes of violence, but by the inevitability of her control. She could have left them broken, but she hadn't. That, she knew, was the difference between power used for justice and power abused for cruelty. But she also knew it wasn't over. Their humiliation tonight would not end here. Men like them did not accept defeat quietly. They would twist this, manipulate it, invent stories to reclaim their dominance. The thought settled into her mind like a weight. This was no longer just about her evening, her groceries, or her dignity. This was about something larger, something systemic, something that demanded more than a fighter's instinct. It demanded foresight, proof, and strategy. The two officers groaned as they tried to collect themselves, their faces etched with fury and shame. Ronda stood tall in the center of the lot, her shoulders squared, her gaze unflinching. She had answered their aggression not with words but with the discipline of her body, the legacy of her training. And though for the moment she had prevailed, she knew with an unshakable certainty that the fight was far from finished. The ordinary evening had been shattered completely now. What remained was a battlefield of a different kind. And as she watched the officers drag themselves upright, She prepared for the next assault, not of fists or force, but of lies and betrayal. The night air was heavy with the smell of asphalt and broken pride. Both officers had pushed themselves up from the ground, their uniforms disheveled, their faces red from exertion and humiliation. They were no longer the swaggering predators who had closed in on her minutes before. Their authority was cracked, their confidence shattered, and in its place grew something far more dangerous than physical force: vindictive spite. Ronda could see it in their eyes, the smoldering anger of men who had been exposed and defeated in a way they could not accept. Losing a fight in front of an audience was one thing. Losing control to the very person they had mocked and tried to dominate was something else entirely. The taller one wiped a smear of dirt from his cheek and spat onto the pavement. He moved slower now, cautious of her presence, as though her body itself was a warning sign not to approach too recklessly. But his expression hardened into something uglier than before. The humiliation wasn't enough. He needed a way to erase it, to rewrite the story. His partner, still coughing from the chokehold, pushed himself upright with trembling arms. His grin was gone, replaced by the pallor of anger and desperation. For a few tense seconds, no one moved. Ronda stood by her truck, her shoulders squared, her eyes unyielding. They glared back, caught between fear and fury, searching for a way to reclaim the dominance they had lost. And then she saw it happen. The taller officer's hand slipped into his jacket pocket, and when it emerged, he was holding a small clear plastic bag. Inside was a white powder that glimmered faintly under the harsh lot lamps. The world seemed to contract into that single object. It was obvious what he meant it to be, obvious how he planned to use it: a staged discovery, a fabricated crime, an erasure of everything that had just occurred. Her victory over their bodies would be twisted into evidence of her corruption. The taller one held it up between two fingers as if he had stumbled upon it, his face alight with mock triumph. "Well, look what we have here," he said loudly, his tone theatrical, already rehearsing the lie he would repeat in reports and courtrooms. "Guess the champ's got more than groceries in her truck." His partner forced a weak laugh, though his voice cracked with strain. "Knew it. Nobody's clean forever. You fighters, you all fall the same way. Fame, then drugs. Fits perfect." His words were shaky, more desperate than convincing, but the intent was plain. Together they would build a story where she was no victim, no champion, but just another criminal. Ronda's chest tightened, not from fear but from a cold, steady realization. This was the escalation she had sensed, the retaliation she had expected. They couldn't beat her body, so they would try to break her through the system. A planted bag of powder, a false arrest, the weight of the badge against the weight of her word. It was a trap as old as corruption itself, but she was not unprepared. What they didn't know was that when their hands had first brushed too close, when their words had sharpened into threats, she had slipped her phone into recording mode. Tucked discreetly on the dashboard mount, it had been capturing every moment. The mocking taunts, the aggressive frisk, the rough handling, and now the sudden miracle of a plastic bag appearing from a pocket that was not hers. The lens had seen it all, silent and impartial. She let her eyes flick briefly toward the phone, ensuring it was angled correctly, then back at the officers. Her face remained unreadable, calm even as her heart pounded with the weight of strategy. Every instinct as a fighter told her to strike, to tear the bag from his hand and end the farce physically. But another part of her, the part that had learned the hard lessons of public defeat and media scrutiny, reminded her that strength was not only in fists. Sometimes survival depended on patience, on letting arrogance expose itself fully before delivering the counter. The taller officer strutted toward her truck, holding the bag aloft like a prize. He leaned in through the open passenger door, tossing aside her ruined groceries, until he found a corner of the seat where he could theatrically discover the contraband. His partner whistled low, shaking his head in mock disappointment, as though they had uncovered some inevitable flaw in her character. Fighter, role model, champ, he sneered, and now just another junkie with a busted career. Guess we'll be the ones to break that story. Ronda remained still, watching every motion, her expression a mask of cold calculation. Inside, the anger burned hotter than ever. They thought they had turned the tables, that a small bag and a false report could erase who she was. But she knew better. This wasn't the end of her story. It was evidence for the beginning of theirs. The taller officer spun back toward her, holding the bag out as if presenting undeniable proof. "Caught red-handed," he declared, his voice loud enough to carry across the empty lot, as if already rehearsing for the jury that would never come. "You're finished." His partner laughed again, though uneasily, his eyes darting nervously toward the phone mounted on the dash. He seemed to realize something but said nothing, trapped between loyalty and survival. Ronda let the silence stretch, the bag hanging in the air like a lie waiting to be torn apart. Then slowly, deliberately, she reached for her phone. The officers tensed, hands twitching toward their belts, but she didn't move quickly. She didn't make it a struggle. She simply tapped the screen, locking in the recording, sending it automatically to cloud storage where it could not be erased. The confirmation blinked briefly, unseen by them, but noted by her. It was done. The truth was secure. When she looked back at them, her eyes were steady, unblinking. The taller one's grin faltered for the first time, as though he sensed something had slipped beyond his control. His partner shifted uneasily, his earlier arrogance crumbling into nervous glances between them. The stage they had set so carefully was no longer theirs to control. Yet they pushed on, desperate to salvage their illusion. The taller officer shoved the bag into her ruined grocery sack, snapping a picture with his phone as though capturing damning evidence. His hands shook slightly, betraying the fury that mixed with fear. The leaner one muttered under his breath, chain of custody, as though reciting procedure could cleanse the corruption of what they were doing. Ronda watched them with the same patience she had once reserved for opponents who thought they had her trapped against the cage. She knew how this worked. Let them think they had won. Let them overcommit, expose themselves fully. Then when the moment came, she would strike not with fists, but with truth. The taller one finally turned back toward her, cuffs in hand again, his face twisted into a mask of false authority. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice louder than necessary, a performance for an invisible crowd. His partner stepped closer, nodding as though affirming a story they both knew was rotten. Ronda did not resist when the cuffs clicked around her wrists. She let them believe they had her pinned again. But inside, her mind was already 3 steps ahead. Every detail of the recording, every second of their words and actions, burned into memory and secured in data they could not touch. They thought they had written her ending, but in truth they had written their own. As the taller one shoved her toward the patrol car, his grip rough on her arm, she kept her eyes fixed forward. She could feel the storm building, not only within her but beyond, in the inevitable reckoning that awaited them. This night was not finished. It had only shifted from one battlefield to another, from asphalt to courts, from fists to evidence. And as the car door slammed behind her, she sat in the back seat, her wrists bound, her gaze steady, knowing that her fight had just entered a new round. The patrol car's engine droned as it pulled out of the lot, the reflection of the street lamps gliding across the windshield like indifferent eyes. Ronda sat in the back seat, her wrists chafing against the cold bite of steel, her body jostling with every turn. The taller officer drove, his jaw locked, his face set in grim determination. His partner sat stiffly in the passenger seat, still nursing the ache of her chokehold. His breaths uneven, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the rearview mirror where her calm, unbroken stare lingered. They wanted her to look afraid, to wilt beneath the weight of their supposed victory. Instead, she sat upright, her expression collected, her silence heavier than any curse she could have spoken. The bag of white powder sat sealed in an evidence pouch on the front console, like a poisonous centerpiece in their twisted play. To them, it was the key to erasing what had just occurred, the means to turn humiliation into triumph. But for her, it was nothing more than an artifact of their corruption, already captured on video, already immortalized in the cloud beyond their reach. The phone resting inside her pocket carried their downfall, and though they didn't know it yet, their story was already slipping away from them. The drive was short, but every second stretched long. The taller officer muttered under his breath, rehearsing the lines he would put in his report. Resisting arrest, suspicious activity, controlled substances. His partner chimed in, hesitant at first, then louder, as though by speaking the lies enough times they could make them true. Ronda closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in concentration. She replayed the timeline in her mind, every detail precise, every word spoken etched into memory. Fighters trained not only their bodies, but their minds, drilling responses until they became instinct. This was no different. She was preparing her testimony, her counterattack, her path forward. By the time they arrived at the station, word had already begun to ripple outward. A video uploaded automatically from her phone had been copied, viewed, and shared in places the officers could not control. Journalists sniffing for stories, activists wary of abuses, fans who still followed her life, all had begun to spread the truth before the cruiser even rolled into the lot. What the officers thought was their greatest victory was already unraveling, thread by thread, under the weight of exposure. Inside the fluorescent corridors of the station, the charade continued. The taller officer shoved her into a holding room with unnecessary force, the cuffs finally removed but leaving raw red marks on her wrists. He sneered, his voice thick with menace. "Enjoy the night, champ. Tomorrow you're just another mugshot." His partner laughed weakly, though his eyes betrayed unease. He had seen the way her gaze never wavered, had felt the iron certainty in her grip. Somewhere deep down he already knew the walls were closing in, though he lacked the courage to admit it. Hours bled together in the holding cell. Ronda sat on the narrow bench, her back straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Others might have paced, shouted, demanded answers. She conserved her energy, like she always had before the bell, letting stillness become her weapon. She knew the wheels were already turning outside, that her silence was not emptiness, but pressure building, waiting to be released. Morning brought chaos. The video had gone viral overnight, flooding social media with outrage. Clips of the officers' taunts, their rough handling, the miraculous appearance of the plastic bag, all had been dissected, replayed, and condemned. Networks ran the footage on loop, anchors speaking in tones of shock and indignation. Her name, once chanted in arenas, now filled headlines across the country. Not for a fight in the octagon, but for exposing the darker arena of abuse and corruption that thrived in the shadows of authority. Lawyers arrived, summoned not by her, but by the momentum of truth. Civil rights advocates, women's groups, veterans organizations, all rallied around her, their voices amplifying hers before she even spoke. By noon, federal investigators were on site, the precinct swarming with scrutiny. The taller officer's bravado cracked when confronted with the evidence. his face pale as stone when shown the video he had never realized existed. His partner broke even faster, stammering in interviews, his words betraying their conspiracy, his loyalty collapsing under the weight of inevitable consequence. The trial that followed became a national spectacle. In court, Ronda sat not as a victim, but as a figure of composure, recounting with clarity every insult, every unlawful touch, every staged maneuver meant to destroy her. The prosecution presented the video, her testimony aligning with every frame. The defense faltered, scrambling to explain inconsistencies that could not be smoothed over. One by one, the officers' credibility unraveled until what remained was the undeniable truth of their corruption. The verdict was swift. Both men were convicted, one sentenced to years behind bars, the other stripped of his badge, his pension, his dignity. Their names, once hidden behind authority, became synonymous with disgrace. The department itself was shaken to its foundations, forced to implement sweeping reforms under the pressure of public fury. Mandatory training, oversight committees, community accountability, words that had long been promises, finally became practice. But the story did not end in the courtroom. For Ronda, the fight extended beyond personal vindication. She stood before cameras on courthouse steps, her voice steady as she spoke not of herself, but of others, of women who had endured harassment in silence, of civilians who had been framed, of victims who had never had the platform to make their truth heard. Her presence transformed outrage into movement, her legacy as a fighter merging with her new role as an advocate. Across the country, murals appeared, painted by hands that had once cheered her victories in the cage. They showed not the armbar or the knockout, but her standing tall in the face of uniformed oppression, her eyes unflinching, her stance unbroken. Beneath one in bold letters were the words, "Strength is not silence." In quieter moments when the cameras were gone and the chants faded into memory, Ronda sat alone and reflected. She thought of that night, of the cracked eggs on the asphalt, of the weight of a hand pressing too close, of the gleam of plastic powder under false authority. She remembered the surge of instinct, the restraint she had chosen, the decision to let evidence, not rage, be her ultimate weapon. It had not been the kind of fight she had trained for, but it had been one of the most important of her life. She knew the battle against such abuses was far from over. Others would face what she had faced, many without cameras, without recordings, without voices loud enough to be heard. But she had shown a crack in the system, had forced light into the shadows, and that light could not be dimmed. The cage had taught her to fight with her body. The streets had taught her to fight with her will. And now the world was learning that Ronda Rousey's strength was not confined to an octagon or defined by a belt. It lived in her refusal to yield, in her demand for dignity, in her unbreakable certainty that no badge, no system, no corruption could take away the essence of who she was. The war they had tried to wage against her was lost before it began, because they had mistaken silence for weakness, and they had mistaken a fighter's calm for surrender. But she had known all along what they could not see, that her story was not one of defeat, but of a woman who would not break. And as the world watched her walk forward into the light of a new battle, it was clear that the fight was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, and now because of her, silence had finally found its voice. Don't miss what happens next. Hit subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never skip a story. Check out the next videos on screen for even more shocking twists, and share this one with your friends so they see the truth too.